If you would know the age of the earth, look upon the face of the sea in a storm. Imponderable and ever-changing, the sea has for centuries defied man's attempts to challenge her power. Years ago, the lines were starkly drawn. Elemental force versus human muscle and canvas. This was the age of the great square-rigged ships, driven by the wind, the golden age of sail. The two coasts of America were yet to be linked by rail, and the Panama Canal but a dream. Passage to the Pacific could be made only one way, through the icy seas round the tip of South America, by way of Cape Horn. From cabin boy to ship's master, the Horn left its mark. You could read it in their eyes. They were a special breed of deep-water sailors. They, more than any others, understood the misery and terror the ocean could inflict. Hands frozen to icy rigging. Shipmates swept away by mountainous waves. No other passage tested a crew more severely. The battle for survival was their daily reality. They knew the sea might kill them, and they accepted that. For they were the ship's company. They were sailors, and they would have no other life. And if that devotion meant following their ship to its end, then so it would be. And so it often was. Off Cape Hatteras, the Scilly Isles and the English Channel, Cape Fear, the Potato Patch, the Cape of Good Hope, Hellgate, the Roaring Forties, Cape Disappointment. These were hellholes dreaded by sailors around the world, places where tide, wind, current, or rocks conspired to bring the full fury of the raging sea to bear upon ships and men. But there is one place sailors feared more than any other. In harbors and seaports around the world, they spoke in hushed tones of the storms, the misery, and death at a cold gray rock at the bottom of the world. Cape Horn. Sailors called it Cape Stiff. With 100-knot winds and 60-foot seas, it was the ultimate test of a mariner's skill and a ship's strength. Sailors talk of the blind horn's hate. Call it superstition, if you will. To a captain, it was common sense. The prudent course was charted far toward the south, where the ship might bear a better chance for survival. But for many thousands who strayed too close to the rock, the last thing they ever saw was the haunted face of Cape Horn. The coast of Maine has changed only a little since the days when the great tall ships slid down the ways of Searsport, Bath, and Kennebunkport to seek fortune round the Horn. Those ships are gone now. But the skills that built them survive, and that is well. The skills are a legacy, telling of men in another age, what those men believed was good, and how they believed things should be. The practice of these skills joins the generations in preserving a piece of our great-grandfather's world, ships that served in one of man's greatest adventures. Ships like the whaler Charles W. Morgan and the little bark Joseph Conrad, both veterans of the Cape Horn trade, now docked in Mystic, Connecticut. Ships like the Balclutha in San Francisco, the Star of India in San Diego, and in Greenwich, England, the last of the clipper ships, the Cutty Sark. To see them and walk their decks is to step back in time, to leave the land behind and ride the dreamless sea in a tall ship leaning on the wind.
Ships of the land, ships of the Lorn. Some who wish they'd never been born, they are the ghosts of Cape Horn. All around a riddle-de-rum with a rim-dim-diddy and a rum-dum-dum. Sailing away at the break of dawn, they are the ghosts of Cape Horn. See them all in sad repair, demons dance everywhere, southern gales, tattered sails, and none to tell the tale. Come all of you rustic old sea follow the bright southern cross, you were rounding the horn in the eye of a storm when you lost her one day, and you read all your letters from oceans away, and you took them to the border of the sea. Around old Cape Horn, ships of the land, ships of the morn. Some who wish they'd never been born, they are the ghosts of Cape Horn. All around our riddle-de-rum with a rim-dim-diddy and a rum-dum-dum. Sailing away at the break of dawn, they are the ghosts of Cape Horn.
From Maine to Georgia, the East Coast seaports of the early 1800s were lined with whalers, coastal schooners, fishing sloops, and deep-water packet ships, all fueling the commerce of a young, growing nation. Americans shared an innocent exuberance in those years, a sense that they could go anywhere and do anything. The common man's dream of opportunity and adventure, and the aristocrat's dream of empire, found a common vehicle in these ships. The ships that settled California. The ships that challenged Cape Horn. The voyage began in the forests of Maine with the felling of tall, slender pine for the ship's mast and spars. Patterns built to the lines of a finely carved model were traced onto the timber. Thus, the shape of the builder's model became the shape of the ship. Her form was literally in the eye of the craftsman. There were no blueprints here, only skill and caring. The belly of the ship's great skeleton took shape. Arched ribs of sweetly curved oak and angled knees of crooked hackmatack living creatures of the forest transformed into a living thing of the sea. No two pieces of wood were quite the same, and none but the keel from which they grew was quite straight. There was nothing accidental here. Every curve, every subtle variation was based upon generations of experience and upon the hard-won learning of what worked at sea. Early each morning, a steam box would be fired up to cook the planks of long-leaf yellow pine that formed the vessel's outer skin. The steam softened the tough fibers so the wood could be bent to the shape of the hull. Each generation refined the process a bit and made a few changes. Such was the evolution of the shipwright's art, the high technology of their day and the embodiment of 4,000 years' experience under sail.
Oh, they call me Hanging Johnny. Away, boys, away. They say I hang for money. So hang, boys, hang. Well, first I hung me brother. Away, boys, away. And then I hung me mother. So hang, boys, hang. I hang a brutal mother. Away, boys, away. The same as any other. So hang, boys, hang. Come hang and sway together. Away, boys, away. And hang for better weather. So hang, boys, hang. It's a rope for me, my ladder. Away, boys, away. Let's all hang together. So hang, boys, hang.
With each ship, the last plank or shutter plank had a special meaning. Like the keystone in a Roman arch, it bound up all the forces in the structure and completed the hull. And the ship had to be well found if she were to survive the long voyage westward, the 18,000-mile voyage around Cape Horn. In the magic year of 1849, San Francisco became a magnet for thousands of Americans. East Coast newspapers proclaimed it the American dream come true. Fame and fortune for a few days' work, if you were lucky. The California gold rush was on. Accounts of the discovery could scarcely command belief, but believe they did. 100,000 of them seeking instant wealth. The country was swept with gold fever. Some came in covered wagons, 3,000 miles across the American wilderness. But most of the 49ers came by sea, around the Horn, in what was described as the greatest human migration since the Crusades. Shipyards could barely keep up with the demand for fast passage to the gold fields. A new breed of ship was born. For one brief, glorious decade, they were the finest, fastest, and most money-making ships that ever furrowed the seas. The legendary California Clippers. They were the aristocrats of sail, tall, proud, and fast as the wind. With long, streamlined hulls and towering masts, they were speed machines, pure and simple. Their kind would never be seen again. There was magic even in their names. Sovereign of the seas, wings of the morning, witch of the waves, young America. Their swift passages cut the journey time to San Francisco in half, and the swiftest of all, the Flying Cloud, electrified the world by making San Francisco in only 89 days. In the year before the gold rush, only 8 ships had called at the sleepy little town of San Francisco. But in the golden year of 1849, an incredible 777 lay at anchor in the bay, transforming her harbor into a forest of masts. It was a shanty town born overnight. The human onslaught brought with it rampant lawlessness. The first 6 years of the San Francisco gold rush saw 1,200 murders committed with but 2 convictions. Vigilante mobs dispensed their own brand of justice, and a culprit was always found. The demands of the city for building materials were often met by cadavers of derelict ships, their timber and iron scarce commodities. For ships returning to the east, a willing crew was an even scarcer commodity. $40 a head was at one time the going rate paid to crimps for delivering men in any condition to the forecastle. Their haunts were the waterfront boarding houses and dives along the street that came to be known as the infamous Barbary Coast. A gentleman was advised to be armed, for everywhere were the crimps, ready and able to make a tidy, bloody profit selling his body. Sweetening the snare were 2,000 French ladies imported to provide a very traditional service. One enterprising lady made a regular business of chloroforming sailors and then selling them by the boatload to crew-hungry captains. When her husband, Shanghai Brown, died, Chloroform Kate took over his business. When her habit of sniffing chloroform at last did her in, she was, at her own request, given a grand funeral, a faded picture of a clipper ship pinned to her ample bosom, and then, or so the story goes, she was dumped at sea from a garbage scow. The Civil War. Most of the clipper ships were sold off, though a few fell victim to rebel gunboats. In the years which followed, the nation turned its attention inward, away from the sea. San Francisco was changing too. It had become a respectable city where families picnicked by the shore and returned home by trolley. Downtown on Market Street, commerce flourished and the city bustled with activity. A new ethnic quarter sprang up as thousands of Chinese were imported to the West Coast for cheap labor. Many were signed on to crews as seamen. The harbor of the 1870s was filled with a new breed of steel and iron ship, 4 times that of a typical gold rush vessel. But our expanding industrial society find no place for their kind. The railroad was coming. Soon steel tracks would span the continent. Instead of 89 days, the journey from east to west coast would take but a week. It would be the death knell for the age of sail. From the shipyards of Britain, France, and Germany came giant 4- and 5-masted full riggers. With their New England half-sisters, wooden ships known as Downeasters, they formed the last generation of ships powered by the wind. A gesture of defiance to the clock of technology. Grain was now the main cargo, and the ever-encroaching steamers could not compete in the Cape Horn trade. And here is where sail survived. The men who sailed in the iron ships and the Downeasters carried on a way of life changed little in centuries. Fishing lines were always out and harpoons were always ready to haul in tuna or bonita. It meant extra work for the ship's cook, but fresh meat for the crew, a welcome change in their diet of salted meat and potatoes. There might even be leftovers for the ship's animals as a treat for the mascot, or to fatten up the only other source of fresh meat. Sundays, by tradition, were a day of comparative rest, the only day the crew could wash and clean up. Time for a haircut in the open air, or mending one's clothes, or practicing a favorite hobby. Soon enough, it would be back to the unending work of the ship. Several times each day, a long knotted line was cast overboard to measure the ship's speed. The line paid out for 14 seconds as the ship moved on. Then it was hauled in, and the ship's speed was counted in knots. Each man had to master a number of skills necessary for the ship's maintenance. Injuries were inevitable. Every man on board was expected to work as long as he had strength to stand. Even a broken bone was not a certain excuse. Every moment of every day, every man had a job to do. The mates made sure of that. And the mate kept busy too. He had the captain to answer to. Such was the way of a sailing ship. A big ship could have over 30 miles of rigging, as many as 500 separate lines. Everyone on board had to know the name and exact position of each line, even on the darkest night. Daily routine was hard, but as the ship neared Cape Horn, it became backbreaking. The fair weather sails came down and were stowed below, rolled tightly to preserve precious space.
Go down, you blood-red roses, go down, and it's mighty crafty round Cape Horn. Go down, you blood-red roses.
Every part of the rigging was overhauled. The crew would be busy for days, splicing, tarring, and reserving. The work was tedious, but it had to be done.
My dear old mother wrote a letter to me. Go down, you blood-red roses, go down.
Skill and patience applied here might mean survival at Cape Horn.
Blood-red roses, go down. Oh, you pinks and posies, go down, you blood-red roses, go down.
Mending the heavy weather sails was a tremendous undertaking requiring all hands. A single sail could weigh a ton, and hoisting it 80 feet to the main yard called for many grueling turns of the capstan. Up aloft, sailors and mates worked together, wrestling the new canvas. Feet above the ocean or standing on the deck, each man knew what the other would do. Each man depended on the other. Crew and ship became a single living thing, ready to fight for survival against the fury of Cape Horn.
She sailed great seas both night and day.
New York City in the 1880s, the eastern end of the Cape Horn trade, and the major port of a young nation rapidly becoming a world power. Alive with ferry boats, coastal schooners, and downeasters, it seemed to herald a new age. The great bridge that would soon join Manhattan to Brooklyn was but a hint of the marvels that would follow. But traditions kept on, and old ways died hard. On South Street, the street of ships, sail still offered a way of life, even as iron-hulled steamers threatened the stately but slower square riggers. More than ever, experienced crew was hard to raise. The hard-bitten elements were wise to Shanghaiing and the brutality in a downeaster forecastle. Unwary immigrants, sea stiffs, and the waterfront lowlife were not. They were the blood trade of New York's bodymongers, turned over to impatient Yankee captains and hard-case mates who enforced their will with the boot and the bully club. Despite the promise of fierce discipline at sea, the dreamers came and were met by the ships that still offered a last chance for adventure. The Down East shipyards of Maine still built traditional wooden vessels, refusing to compromise with the steel riveter. When New York capitalists stopped investing in wooden ships, the shipbuilding families of Maine became ship owners as well. They had to. Captains and their mates, the builders, sailmakers, riggers, chandlers, they were all proud to chip in. These were second-generation clippers with a century of Yankee learning in their lines. They were called Down Easters, and when they were launched, the whole town turned out. Plank owners, those who had an interest in the new ship, came on board to inspect their investment and celebrate its christening. Even the babies were brought on board for their first look at their future livelihood. And perhaps a sailor's last look at his loved ones. In March of 1890, a new downeaster was launched in Phippsburg. The fortunes of the town rode with her. The fortunes of one man in particular, Jesse T. Carver, last of a distinguished family of sea captains. At age 56, anxious to retire, Carver gambled his life savings on a quarter interest in the new ship. In New York, she was rigged with her first set of sails, the maiden voyage of the St. Mary. Loading and preparations finished, the St. Mary's crew came aboard. Young and old, shellbacks and landsmen of different nationalities and capabilities. They would eat well and work hard. That was the down east way. On a balmy May afternoon, the St. Mary was towed down the East River through the Narrows to the open sea, bound for Cape Horn. It would be her first voyage, and it would be her last. For 10 weeks, the St. Mary bore south, on course in the strong winds of late spring. The days grew warmer, and she picked up speed, romping through the trade winds. For Captain Carver, this passage was crucial. He'd staked his retirement on the St. Mary's future earnings. But there was another reason. Though not to blame, the master already had lost 2 ships in his career and was determined to clear his reputation with one last effort. This time, nothing must go wrong. On August 6th, the St. Mary was in sight of the Horn. The seas were unusually calm, so Carver had little reason to expect trouble. But at Cape Horn, the unexpected is the rule. That night, there were 11 ships in close company off Cape Horn. One of them, the Magellan, had tacked dangerously close to the St. Mary. Magellan sank with all hands, but the St. Mary managed to stay afloat. Her larboard rigging ripped away. She could no longer steer effectively. Desperately, Carver forced her about and made for safety 350 miles downwind in the Falkland Islands. For 3 days and nights, the captain and his crew battled to drive the St. Mary on to the Falklands. It was the jinx of the Horn, bad weather hounding a damaged ship. On the 4th day, while the exhausted captain slept, the lookout sighted breakers. The crew tried to bring the big ship about into open water. Instead, they headed for the hidden shoals of Pinnacle Rocks. When the crew rowed ashore the next morning, Carver refused to leave. 3 times I've been in trouble, he said, and this is my last. A day later, the crew returned to the wreck and found the captain's body with white foam at his mouth. His death remains a mystery. The St. Mary's crew landed on a remote beach in East Falkland and found their way to a shepherd's cabin. To a man, they were safe. The St. Mary broke up in a storm a few weeks later. The Cape Horn winds still howl at Pinnacle Rock. Captain Carver is gone, but the St. Mary survives him. Today, her bones are among the Earth's last remains of a downeaster. And before these 2 are destroyed, men from the 20th century have come to claim them. Marine archaeologist Peter Throckmorton is aware that with each new tide, a piece of our maritime heritage is lost to the sea.
Mike, hold on to this end, right? I'm going to kind of cut this guy so it's out of the way.
He and his crew have come to remove a 40-foot section of the St. Mary's tween decks for return to Maine, where she was built nearly a century ago. Not far from the St. Mary wreck, penguins play in icy waters, indifferent to the treacherous weather that drove many ships to their ends.
Okay, Mike, we'll see you in half an hour, eh? Look at it, run, track.
Today in Port Stanley, the major town, the ribs of a once grand ship serve as fence posts. Dusty attics are crammed with nautical odds and ends. There are whole ships to be found here as well, like the Charles Cooper, an 1850s New York packet ship. Throckmorton has removed the Cooper's sternpiece, a magnificent example of the Yankee woodcarver's art. Using a silicone rubber molding compound, he makes a detailed mold of the carving, taking care that no details are missed.
Let's lift it now and give me that stick real easy, okay? Let's get it as high as we can. Okay. Come from there. Okay, see if we can get going. Just very easy. Easy. That's right. Just keep the push. Come on, let's go take the end piece off. Okay. Let's go try to roll it back. That's this way. Okay, well, lift him up. Ooh, yeah, he's there.
The molding material will record the finest intricacies in the carving, down to the grain of the wood.
All right, well, I suppose we better let him go right over it.
19th century craftsmanship preserved for all time by 20th century technology.
Look at that red paint still there. Really a nice job.
These are the casualties of the war with Cape Horn. A war fought long and hard, but never really won. A struggle which claimed many thousands of lives and many hundreds of ships. No one really knows how few remain. The war with Cape Horn lasted for more than 300 years. It's over now, but its legacies survive. block and tackle from a Falklands wreck is now used as a gallows for butchering sheep. Time and geography say otherwise, but the islands resemble nothing so much as rural Scotland a century ago. With no roads, television, or newspapers, the outside world has been kept at a comfortable distance. And although the Cape Horn wind ships no longer limp into their harbor, the Cape Horn weather still dominates their lives.
This is the Falkland Islands Broadcasting Station, broadcasting on frequencies of 536 and 2370 kilohertz. The weather forecast for the next 24 hours. Tonight there will be variable cloud amounts with some clear periods and isolated showers. Tomorrow there will be variable cloud amounts with some sunny periods at first, becoming mainly cloudy with risk of rain or drizzle and fog patches during the late morning and afternoon. The wind will be fresh to strong northwest. Lighting up times for tomorrow, 7:15 p.m.
Come on now, drink, you know this song.
What is it? I'll say generally if you got the words, you still haven't got the words right, right? Bravo!
The Falkland Islands have preserved another age, an age that buried thousands of ships. A haunting memory remains in their songs, in the vast cemetery of their harbors. It breathes in the rotting timbers of an East India trade ship, and in the bones of Snow Squall, the last of the American clipper ships that astounded the world with their dignity and beauty. The ships that met Cape Horn and could go no further.
Kiss your loved ones goodbye. Leave them all on the land. I can promise you more than any woman on shore ever can. Raise your sails to the wind. Turn your face to the sea. Your heart is for me, and with a push of the wind and the pull of the tide, on the edge of my world you will ride, with the song of the sea, with the song of the sea. Feel the surge of the waves, hear the gulls as they cry. Well, they're just like you, they gotta soar on the blue or they'll die. And you'll always be mine, you belong to the sea. Just for me, and with a push of the wind and the pull of the tide, on the edge of my world you will ride, with the song of the sea, with the song of the sea, with the song of the sea.
If there was a man on board with some romantic notion about life at sea, and there were always several, Cape Horn would knock such foolishness out of him. Up aloft, to loose sail or shorten it, hauling frozen canvas and icy lines, utterly relying on the soundness of their gear. A loose knot or broken foot rope could send 30 men to their deaths. The ship's work was unending, and fatigue became an enemy. So the ingrained disciplines of order and routine took over, and the men carried on mechanically. It was their only defense against the chaos and terror about them. "15,000 times at least the struggle was repeated as man and ship challenged the Horn. Most survived, but many weren't so lucky. No grit or skill or courage could save them that came too close to the rock itself. And as an anxious world of landsmen waited, the ship would first be reported overdue, then missing, and finally lost with all hands. Tens of thousands of seamen vanished with their ships. The ocean floor, a common, unmarked grave. The bodies of sailors and sea captains were almost never recovered. The price of a dream, to leave the shore behind and to never look back. Many a New England grave has no coffin, only a tombstone. A final acceptance that a son or a father would never return. At the height of the war with Cape Horn, some towns lost nearly an entire generation of young men to the sea. The grisly harvest was collected. The townfolk bore them away, knowing that but for Providence, it could have been them. The war with Cape Horn was long and hard. The war is over now. The captains and the crews are gone. Only scattered monuments remain to tell of their supreme effort. The prayer for permission to sail within the interface of sea and sky, denied. The sea provides for order. Cape Horn is still there.
Ships of the line, ships of the morn. Some who wish they'd never been born, they are the ghosts of Cape Horn. All around a riddle-de-rum with a rim-dim-diddy and a rum-dum-dum. Sailing away at the break of dawn, they are the ghosts of Cape Horn. See them all in sad repair, demons dance everywhere. Southern gales, tattered sails, and none to tell a tale. Come all of you rustic old sea dogs, follow the bright Southern Cross. You were rounding the Horn in the eye of a storm when you lost her one day. You read all your letters from oceans away, and you took them to the bottom of the sea. Ships of the line, ships of the morn. Some who wish they'd never been born, they are the ghosts of Cape Horn.